Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Cann with Harbour Insight, and with me I have Andrew Penkethman, Chief Executive of Ardea Resources. Ardea is working on its Kalgoorlie Nickel Project and the DFS to be coming out later on this year with its JV partners Sumitomo and Mitsubishi. This is one of a series of conversations that we're having with Andrew, and today we really want to get into the nickel market and understanding what kind of environment the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project will be delivering its product into. Welcome, Andrew.
Great to be here. Thanks, Chris.
Our research indicates that investors are very much looking at natural resource equities for exposure to the energy transition. Nickel is obviously a key part of that. What's your feeling about what's happening in the market at the moment? Obviously, you're talking to investors on a regular basis. What's the feeling out there in terms of investors that want that kind of exposure and where nickel sits in the mix of battery minerals and energy transition leverage?
Great question, Chris. And I guess to set the scene, nickel is classified as a critical mineral in Australia, Japan, US and Canada, in line with all of our key allies. And if we look at that demand for nickel, obviously we've got traditional uses such as stainless steel that are going to continue with a strong compound annual growth rate. And then in more recent times, we've seen the rapidly increasing demand around the energy transition, in particular for lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles and large-scale energy storage. So firstly, the fundamentals and the growth for nickel are assured. In terms of supply, we have seen a rapid increase in production in recent years, particularly out of Indonesia. They are now the largest producer of nickel. However, we've got key considerations around supply chain security, diversity of supply, security of supply chains, and we think with that background, the development of the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project is essential. And in terms of our pathway to production, the earliest we could be in production is 2029, 2030, and we're determining that precise timing as part of the in-progress definitive feasibility study. But certainly all the independent forecasts I see from the independent experts, whether it be Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, CRU, Woodmac, etc. We think our timing to production is exceptional, and particularly given the large scale and long life of this project. We've got a 40-year ore reserve that's only assessing 6 or 9 deposits. So in reality, we expect this project to be operating for 50, 60 years. So it will have the ability to operate through multiple cycles within the nickel commodity price cycle. And we think our timing to production is incredibly well placed, with most of the research I'm seeing expecting the nickel market to flip back into deficit from about 2030 onwards, and also to see a corresponding increase in both the nickel and cobalt price.
Okay. I wanted to get into a bit more detail on some of that supply side dynamic in a little while, but just in terms of what's happening right now, before we get into that longer term scenario and the real fundamental drivers of nickel, can you give us a bit of a feel for what's happening in the market? Obviously, it's a small market, there's volatility. What are you seeing at the moment? What are you hearing? And what does it look like in terms of maybe the next, if we can talk about the 6 to 12 months?
Yep, no, sure. So look, currently the nickel price is about $15,000 US a tonne. On a historic average, that's a fair price. But in terms of the cost of doing business, well, we're seeing that increase right around the world. And the intel that I'm receiving is that the rate at which nickel production has expanded in Indonesia is unsustainable. Mining economics 101, you're going to access your highest value ore first. There's not an infinite supply of nickel resources in Indonesia nor around the world, so they're mineral resources and oil reserves are progressively being depleted. Certainly the intel I'm receiving is that there will be a rapid depletion at their mineral resources and oil reserves, and after the next 5 to 10 years, we think our timing is just perfect to come into production.
Okay, when you're talking about rapid depletion there, are we likely to see the effects of that in the near term? Obviously, it's going to increase in severity as time progresses, but are we at a bit of an inflection point? And I'll stop short of asking you to predict prices or anything like that, Andrew. But is this effect that you're talking about, is that something we're going to see in market dynamics relatively soon?
Look, I very much believe it will be. It'll be more of a gradual transition, but similarly, the cost of doing business around the world's continuing to increase, regardless of what jurisdiction you're based in. Existing operations, increasingly will require more working capital. A lot of the nickel production from some jurisdictions overseas doesn't meet the high ESG expectations of countries like Australia, Japan, Korea, the United States, United Kingdom, essentially Australia and our key allies. So if we were in production today, I'm being told by potential offtake partners that, our production would be sought after in preference to most other production around the world because of our very high expected ESG standards that are in line with being a Western Australian-based nickel cobalt producer and meeting the requirements, but also the plans we have in place for making sure that our nickel cobalt supply does meet the highest standards. So our production's always going to be in demand, and the future outlook for both nickel and cobalt is incredibly robust.
As you point out, the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project mine life, the initial mine life, that's before you look at any kind of growth opportunities and increase in reserves and resources, is 40 years. Very long-term project. When you're looking at that demand scenario kind of out on those horizons, obviously very difficult to get a real fix on things. What's the window of tolerance, and what are the things that are the variables that may or may not happen that could shift demand, to the top end of that window or towards the bottom? Is it just about EVs and storage? Or what are the other things that people should be looking at if they're trying to get a feel for that market?
Yeah, I think increasingly nickel's used in a broad range of applications. So just about everyone's got a smartphone these days. There's nickel, and those uses, from a technological perspective, are going to continue to increase, and then running in parallel with that, we've got compound annual growth rate of several percent for traditional uses such as stainless steel, and there's no doubt the world's going to continue to expand. We've seen most recently the rapid expansion in China. There's been a lot of discussion now for at least the last decade on the growing role India will play. We're seeing their population to continue to expand, the demands on new infrastructure, new technology, and raising the overall standard of living for the entire nation is going to continue to ensure that we have that demand. And even countries like Australia, where our population continues to expand as well. So I think the outlook for nickel and cobalt's never been brighter.
And you have mentioned the ESG, or the supply chain security dynamics. Can we go into a little bit more detail around that, and looking at obviously a critical mineral, but where the supply chains are directed globally, the sources of supply, and when you're talking to potential off-takers who are looking at the product down the track, how important is that ESG element to them? Do they feel a lot of pressure when it comes to making sure that they've got responsible supply?
We saw a lot of supply chain shocks around COVID, and I think there was a big wake-up call for the entire world. And fortunately, we've seen that tend to rebalance. But governments right around the world are very much focused on reliable, secure supply chains, and Australia's working incredibly closely with its key allies to ensure that continues. So I think we've got incredible support within Australia, Japan, but also other key ally nations to see the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project developed, and there's already a great deal of interest in securing offtake from our project, and that could be both directly from the mine gate or similarly with the expectation of Sumitomo Metal Mining processing a fair amount of that material in their existing refineries and key nickel supply chain infrastructure in Japan, but then seeing that product go to key ally nations as well, and whether that be the United States, the EU, etc. So we're seeing increased focus from Australia and all our key allies, and all of those jurisdictions are very much focused on ESG. It is an incredibly important consideration, and whilst I can't ever talk for our joint venture partners, it's quite obvious, it's a key consideration for them, and one of the key factors for wanting to partner with us in the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project, both from a technical perspective and the quality of the resource, but similarly also with the high ESG standards that we expect from the project.
Andrew, that's all we've got time for, but thanks for joining us.
Excellent catch up. Thanks, Chris.